Hey, Casella here. A Meal of Thorns and the Ancillary Review of Books are free and ad-free, and we plan to keep them that way. So, if you're able to chip in financially to keep the podcast and the magazine viable, that would be really cool. Go to patreon.com/ancillary review. We've also got our first yearly fundraiser coming up soon, with the goal of paying our writers and editors. As always, just leaving us a rating or review wherever you listen helps kind of an embarrassing amount. If you can take a couple minutes to do that, or to share an episode you like in your venue of choice, that would make my day. Okay, on to the show. A critic is a creature who has views quite like a camel's. Flowers and fruit he scorns. In the flower garden of the honeyed muse, he starves unless he finds a meal of thorns. Hello, and welcome to A Meal of Thorns, a critical book club from the Ancillary Review of Books. I'm Jake Celebruckins. Each episode, we take one work of speculative fiction and ask a critic, scholar, or writer to talk us through it, how it works, what questions it raises, what it points to. Today, we are reading Lois McMaster Bujold's 2003 fantasy novel Paladin of Souls, and I am delighted to have Liz Bourke here to discuss it with. Liz has a doctorate in classics and is a very active critic and reviewer in the SFF world. You can find lots of her writing at places such as Locus, Reactor, Vector, Strange Horizons, and more. Her nonfiction, including the book Sleeping with Monsters, Reading and Reactions in Science Fiction and Fantasy, has been nominated for the Hugo Ignite British SF and Locus Awards. She maintains a very cool newsletter about history, genre fiction, and their intersections. Liz, thanks so much for joining. How are you?
I'm reasonably well today, apart from it being January. January. Who likes January in the Northern Hemisphere?
I like to think that Buffalo here has adjusted to it a little bit. At least everyone sort of like has their snow shovel like in hand and like their salt bag by their door, and we're sort of like ready for it. So yeah, it's not my favorite time of the year.
Yeah, you guys actually get snow. We just get really cold rain most of the time.
Yeah, we've got, hopefully it'll stay. We've got a couple inches out there. We'll see. We'll see what happens. Before we dive into this book, anything else you have been reading or working on that's interesting you want to share with people?
I actually had to set myself a schedule for reading things because I got so, burned out last year that just choosing what to read seemed very difficult. But I was reading Blood Tide, which by Sophie Burnham, their second novel, which is it's good, really interesting, different take on Empire and stuff. Which I'm supposed to be reviewing for Locus, and I just finished reading Jen Lyons' forthcoming Green and Deadly Things, which it arrived on yesterday, and I opened it to take a look at it and see what it was like, and fortunately I'd already agreed with my wife that I wasn't on primary childcare that day because, I didn't stop reading it until I'd finished it.
Oh, nice. Wonderful.
So I can recommend that one. It's March, I think, and it's a standalone. So it's very fun.
Nice. Oh, cool. Yeah, I've been going through a similar. I had a lot of burnout last year, and I'm scheduling my reading a lot this year. But I did finally circle back. I had heard good things about the works of Vermin by Hiram Ennis that did Leech a couple years ago, and I just hadn't gotten around to it last year. I finally sat down and burned through that. Really loved it. Very much like a not derivative, but felt like classically new weird, in a sort of like Pretty to the Street Station-y kind of way. Really fun, really strange. It's got lots of like giant bugs and strange chemicals that are warping a city, and it was doing some stuff that kind of surprised me. I'll have to come back to it and see if I was just being sort of dim when I started it, but it had this sort of reveal of its own temporal structure that I hadn't picked up on, that like hit me like a shock. And then I went back and like reread the beginning. I was like, oh no, there were clues here. I don't know if this was intended to surprise me, but it has these sort of like alternate timelines that sort of like, just alternate points of narration that revealed some really strange stuff in a way that I thought was really effective. So yeah, highly recommend
Yeah. I mean, one of the things I was really enjoying about Green and Deadly Things is that it's playing with the misremembering of history, which actually links it quite well to Sophie Burnham's Blood Tide. The history of the sort of cataclysmic thing that happened 1,500 years ago has been poorly remembered, and that's causing problems because the cataclysmic thing is cyclical, which is pretty much it as a historian, or as someone who was trained as a historian anyway. Yes.
Yeah. I used to think, in like fantasy novels, whenever they're like, the dragons have been gone, they'll never come back, and there's always one person that knows they're going to come back. It's kind of sad to have that happening so much in reality. And it's not been 1,500 years, right?
No, I mean the funny thing that I find in a lot of fantasy, or at least a lot of the popular fantasy, is how history is knowable and not contestable.
Mm-hmm.
You have these unbroken lines of information, and yes, it's lost, but someone can rediscover it, and there's going to be no question about what they've rediscovered. Rather than, well, what you find is how do you interpret this bit of pot or this bit of inscription, or how do you fit it in with all the other things that you think you know, when you can translate it like maybe 3 different ways, or where it implies 3 different or 4 different or 5 different possibilities.
I'm trying to remember now what books we were talking about. This was something that came up online. A couple of folks were talking about a while ago about how fantasy represents this sort of like unitary history in this way that's kind of weird when you think about it. And it also sort of like passes on that naive conception that that's actually how we understand history. And you don't have to dig very far to get away from that.
Not everybody does it, but the people who don't do it stand out because of this sort of the myth of the knowability and the unbroken, like, there have been kings in this place. There have been kings of the same bloodline for 2,000 years. What?
Mm-hmm.
What? And that's not a constructed narrative to preserve the legitimacy. That's actually you. I don't think there's a monarchy that's lasted more than like 7 or 8 generations in an unbroken line in the real world.
Yeah, I don't know. It's interesting, and it's funny how I think about stuff like, especially if you think about things like Tolkien as sort of like fantasy, that he already has around that a framework that this is just stuff written down, and there are like different versions of it. So it sort of has, it's not quote unquote in the text, but it has this sort of framework around it of, remember, just treat this as a collection of stories that are passed around, and there's different versions. But that's hard to do all the time. Like,
the thing about Tolkien, of course, is that he's an Anglo-Saxonist, a literary specialist, and the mythos that he's creating draws so strongly from the worldview of the text that he's working with in his professional academic stuff, that it gives it a layer of reality in the sense of the coherence of the worldviews and the coherence of the... Brett Devereaux did a really good series on like the military stuff in it, the coherence of the possible. His armies cover ground, the armies in Tolkien cover ground at approximately the same rate that real armies can cover ground under those approximate same circumstances, and that just sort of the groundedness in grounding it in a real makes the numinous aspect of it all the more powerful because it's related to a reality that is underlying and possible. If that makes sense. I'm sure people have said this before in...
Well, and I think that's something we will we'll probably touch on talking about.
I mean, that's one of the things that Paladin of Souls does really, really well.
Yeah, well, let's hop into this. Let's talk about Paladin of Souls. So this was published in 2003 by HarperCollins, which was an EOS imprint. That was later folded into one of HarperCollins, I think Voyager. It is a sequel to The Curse of Chalion. So it's a fantasy novel. It's set in a world loosely inspired by the Reconquista period in the Iberian Peninsula. So think 15th century Spain, but only as a starting point. But it is kind of fun in some of the characters and geography kind of mapping onto it. A key part of how this fantasy works is that there are 5 different gods who are active in the world. They're actually doing stuff. And we'll talk more about religion in this, I'm sure. Paladin of Souls picks up a minor character from the first novel, Ista, who is the mother of the now reigning monarch. She's recovering from a supernatural curse that granted her insight into supernatural forces. While she is on a pilgrimage to escape her confined life at court, Ista and her companions are swept up in a convoluted conflict that includes a demonically enabled undead love triangle of sorts and a seemingly unstoppable invasion of a sorceress army. Paladin of Souls won the Hugo, Nebula, and Locus Awards, and the larger universe that Bujold has now been writing in for some time, called the World of the Five Gods, won the Hugo for Best Series in 2018. And for context, as well, if listeners aren't familiar with Bujold, she is a prolific, celebrated SF author, kind of a titan of the field. She is also well known for her science fiction, her Vorkosigan space opera series. So, Liz, tell me about your relationship either with Paladin of Souls in particular, or with the other books and novellas and works in this series. Kind of what's the draw for you? What's your history with them?
So I read Paladin of Souls within a couple of years of it coming out, and I was still a teenager at the time. I read Curse of Chalian as well. The two of them are very closely linked in my mind, but one of the things that Paladin of Souls did and does really well is it is suffused with a sense of the religious. The fantastical parts of its world building are not magical. They are related to the ways in which divinity can act in the world. And divinity in Paladin of Souls and in the world of the five gods, it can't act directly in the world. If a human being or a human soul is sufficiently open to the possibility, they can be touched in some way by the divinity and move in such a way that they have a connection to the divine that lets them essentially have a sort of second sight and lets them see things and lets them become the instrument of divinity in the world. It is not something that can be forced. It's not something that can be compelled. One of the things that comes up again, both in Chalian, Curse of Chalian, and in Paladin of Souls, is that the gods set many potential saints on the road to the culmination that they want. Only occasionally does one make it all the way to the end, because it's almost a sort of reparative work of the divine, making things better. It's incredibly demanding on ordinary human beings. That although there are like compensations for it, they also go through an awful lot of suffering, because it reminds me of a line, and I'm going to diverge off here, in Julian of Norwich's Revelation of Divine Love, which is that pain purgeth and maketh us to know ourselves. And it's only with the sort of intense amount of self-knowledge and self-awareness and compassion and grace that the potential saints are able to essentially complete the reparative work that they're set on the road to do. The saints in across the world of the five gods are often, they end up being very compassionate and understanding people, but they're often very peculiar ones too. They're a little bit sideways from everybody else. One of the things it's really good at, both Curse of Chalian and Paladin of Souls, and to a lesser extent the Penric and Desdemona books, is giving a sense of the numinous that feels that it is truly bigger than a single person. That these gods, they are compassionate, but they're constrained as well in the way they work. And the relationship between human and divinity is, as it is explicitly laid out in the sort of theology of the texts, feels relatable and real in a way that an awful lot of fantasy religions don't feel real. Mm-hmm. There is an awful lot of fantasy religions feel mechanical. You do this and you do X and Y happens. You say prayer Z and result Z happens. Or the gods are like unsurprisingly horrible beings, or they're fake and it's all a great big lie, or they're just incredibly powerful sorcerers, like in the thinking of the Dragon Age games, where like the ancient elven gods are just incredibly powerful people who set themselves up godlike. I mean, it came at a very impressionable time for me, because I was in my late teens, in the sort of ferment of an atheist in Catholic school who wanted to believe in something but really couldn't. I like to say Catholic school turned me into an agnostic, and a theology undergraduate degree gave me the tools to explain why. It made the religion in it make sense. It's deeply grounded in the world building. It is not exactly unique, but sufficiently its own thing that I don't think there is anything doing the same thing with fantasy religion, even 25 years on. And it just gave me a sense of what was possible to do in fantasy that I hadn't ever seen before. And honestly, I haven't really seen a lot of imitators try to do since. Also, Ista is an amazing protagonist, and again, is a protagonist that I had never seen before and have very rarely seen similar since. When the novel opens, she is so completely trapped in a sort of very small role. In her youth, she was married off to the Roya, the king, who was the subject of a curse, but she didn't know that the royal bloodline of Chalian was cursed. And she had 2 children, and she was given a divine vision. She was shown how the curse could be broken, but she misunderstood. And their attempts to break the curse, which are recounted again in Paladin of Souls, because a lot of Ista's past comes back to essentially haunt her. But she fails. They fail to break the curse. And in doing so, she fails to keep her children safe, which is, as a mother, it is the biggest failure that people who have investment in parenthood have. And speaking as a mother, the idea that you can't keep your children safe is, that it's your fault that you didn't break the curse. That's horrifying. She spends the guts of 20 years not really being able to tell reality from her worst imaginings. She's when you meet her first in Curse of Chalian, she's extremely odd and extremely damaged and extremely grief-stricken. And then she loses, her son dies because of the curse. Not directly, because that's not how curses work. That's not how the mechanisms of the supernatural generally tend to work. But nobody's able to save him and break the curse. And then the curse is broken, and she's still trapped. She is in her mother's house. Everybody thinks that she is, they treat her like a little girl or like a mad woman who must be kept safe from her own impulses, which, would make you mad. And when Paladin of Souls opens, her mother, who was 80, has just died, and she's still trapped. Her daughter is now the Royina, the ruling queen of Chalian, and Ista is still trapped. Ista is still trapped in the same pattern, and all she can see is having to live with her failures and her trappedness. And instead of being mercifully mad and some of the time not knowing that, she's perfectly sane. Now the curse is broken, and she knows exactly how tedious and bitter the rest of her life is looking like being. Nobody's going to trust her to do real work because she's been mad for 20 years.
Yeah, it's such a great starting point, and I know we will, but I want to make sure we circle back around to talk about religion and faith more, because that's such a huge thing. But the character work in here is so interesting. First off, just a cool choice. Ista has, I don't know, 20 lines in the first novel, right? It's a small role, and it's easy to sort of draw a square around, the mad mother and just kind of forget about her plot-wise, right?
Yes, she's the gothic relative that you shut up in an attic.
Yeah, and it's such a cool choice to immediately just pick her, and you're with her through this novel, and she's such a good character. But I was just thinking a lot about this on sort of a craft level. We talk a lot about characterization in genre work, and it's such a huge range. I think a lot of times when I'm thinking of what does it mean to do I don't know, psychological realism or something like that, I'm usually thinking of a more non-genre, more literary fiction, more really getting into their consciousness somehow, or really spending a lot of time really in them. But this is it's a very plot forward book. You do get some of her thoughts, but you're not all the way in. But to me, there's a style of character work that this is just nailing, right? Just creating these characters that have a really strong impression, giving them enough room, enough thought, enough dialogue that you get kind of a sense of what they're about. And you can kind of see, I think, in a lot of Bujold's work, sort of when a character sort of crosses within the circle of kind of her interests, and they suddenly are so fleshed out, even if they don't get a ton of time. This has such a cool cast of supporting characters, and all of them pulling out more and more sides of Ista that's sort of showing her as a more complete character. And again, I'm not saying this is a literary psychological novel, but it's so good at what it's doing.
One of the other things that it does is at the start of the novel, Ista rejects the gods. They failed her and she failed them, and she wants nothing to do with it. Nothing to do with it because she can't see her relationship with them in anything other than that mutual, desperate, horribly grief-producing failure. And then the inciting incident in the first chapter is she takes a mad idea into her head that she will just start walking. She will get away. This does not work out so well, but before her minders catch up with her, she sees a pilgrimage. And she's like, oh, this is a sort of respectable way to escape for a while, at least. Pilgrimage, gods. I reject the gods. But okay, I will pretend. I'll go on pilgrimage. I'll escape for a little while, a holiday. And the first 2 to 3 chapters are just this tension between Ista's completely hypocritical about the sort of purpose of the pilgrimage, but she's doing it so that she can escape and essentially be someone other than who she's been for 20 years among people who don't see her as mad Royine Ista, to sort of get a taste of life. I don't know, all the characters that she has, she finally gets onto this pilgrimage, and these sort of, her pilgrim guide turns out to be this divine of the fifth god, the bastard, who, as he confesses later, he had what he thought was a religiously inspired dream. He wasn't wrong about being a religiously inspired dream, but he essentially stole the role of being her pilgrim guide because he thought it was what the gods were telling him to do. And that makes Ista be all, no, stop. I don't want anything more to do with the gods. Which is just this sort of hilarious and also incredibly moving tension between the longing for a reparative and sort of religious connection and this sort of horrible rejection and sort of a mutual sense of failure, and sort of Ista's really stuck in her sense of herself as stuck as a failure, I think, until she's put in a position where she's had a chance to move past that, and where she's given an opportunity to be a saint again. One of the things that convince her to say yes is a sort of religious message, divinely inspired message, reminding her that the gods sent so many people on the road who could have saved her son, and they all turned aside before it was done. And is she going to turn aside and from saving someone else's son? It's like, I just find this sort of really, really excellent on a skill level that everything ties back, including there's a line in the third chapter where the pilgrimage conductor Dicabon has been telling a sort of a story, explaining the theology of the world in a sort of, he has a sermon, and this is the core of the sermon, and then he invokes the blessings, and then he has some kind of divine inspiration. I'll even quote it. His voice fallen into soothing sing-song of ceremony stumbled for the first time, slowing. He says, and the bastard grant us in our direst need the smallest gifts, the nail of the horseshoe, the pin of the axle, the feather at the pivot point, the pebble at the mountain's peak, the kiss in despair, the one right word, in darkness understanding. And the kiss in despair, the right word, the understanding, these are all things, this in chapter 3, they come back around at the end of the book. And that sort of circularity, the unity of the symbolism, just sort of hooks back together, not in any really obvious way, but in a sense that just on the pure craft level, on the level of making things feel, of making the sort of things matter, small things matter to the larger symbolisms. It's just, Bujold is, on her bad day, is an excellent writer. On her good day, I don't think there's anyone who can match her, and it just really strikes me.
So many thoughts here. So first off, maybe I should say, if people maybe haven't read this in a while, so the way the religion works here is that there are 5 gods. It's sort of a family: the mother, the father, the son, and the daughter, and then the bastard. And I think the bastard is super interesting, just theologically, because the other 4 are so easy to map into sort of a standard, monotheistic religion that has sort of different faces.
And the bastard is the god of things out of season.
Yeah, and this sort of this doorway into the unexpected and things that don't quite fit. I really, really dig that. But kind of jumping back, that idea that not a lot of fantasy is doing this, very, very little fantasy is doing this. I agree completely. And there's you'd mentioned that way that like a lot of times when gods and religion are presented in fantasy, it's either they're just sort of a powerful person, and I think there's a lot of reading, particularly in all of the retellings of like Greek and Nordic mythology, that I think lean way too heavily on they're just people. Gods are just people and sort of miss out.
They're just people, and they're mostly not nice people.
Yeah, and that sort of misses out on all of these like more numinous, more faith-based, sort of more compellingly strange or magical sort of visions of what they can be or can stand for.
More surpassing human understanding.
Yeah.
I mean, to be honest, the sort of ancient Greek myths and legend of the ancient Greek gods, they are people, but more so.
Mm-hmm.
But that's not really interesting in a fantasy context, I think.
Yeah, no, I agree. So I think so that's one way to do it. You mentioned that like there's a lot of just purely mechanistic stuff, right? Where you do the ritual and the thing happens. And I also think there's a way that so much speculative fiction is infused with, and I say this as an atheist, a sort of like unproductive atheism, right? Just like this sort of like assumption. It's kind of scientism, right? It's like this idea that like we know how everything works, everything is mechanical. That's the way it all is, and I think you see that even in a lot of fantasy works.
Oh yeah, so much fantasy adopts there's the whole thing about having a well worked out magic system, where you've just talked about making your magic system essentially be a science. You've talked about just turning it into another form of mechanism, a mechanism that if you do the thing right, it happens. There's no mystery in it. My PhD was on healing cult ritual in the cult of Asclepius in ancient Greece. I've read far too much theory of different approaches to religious experience, and what draws people back to religion is not the mechanistic, it's the mystery, it's the unknowable, the sense that yes, you do the things right, but what you get back is somehow more than what you've done. The whole experience of doing it is more than the component parts. There's some really interesting anthropology on like healing and stuff like that, which I will not talk about because we are not talking about that. But that's not something that comes through in a lot of fantasy. The relationship with the more than human is I mean, it's something that is there in Tolkien's work, because Tolkien, of course, has a sort of intense religiousness. The singing and the sort of the Maiar and the sort of the overworld that creates Middle Earth, it's not mechanistic. It's not something that the human level can easily grasp the greater meanings to it.
Specifically, a word that like sprang into my mind at a specific point when I was rereading it this time was Tolkien's idea of the eucatastrophe. And this idea of grace, and you talked about one of the things I love about how religion works in these books is the idea of the gods setting many saints on the road and they don't all make it, right? Making lots of bets and they don't all win. So it doesn't have this idea that like the gods are truly omnipotent and like when everything does line up, what's magical about it is that it doesn't feel inevitable, right? It doesn't feel like all these places were imperfect. I'm thinking of like, I don't know, something like an M. Night Shyamalan movie, right? Where like everything comes together perfectly, like it was predestined to do this thing exactly, right? That kind of idea that like God is clockwork, right? And it's just set it all in motion and it's all going to wind up at the right place. This doesn't have that, right? There are all these things that rely on choice and rely on chance and rely on people deciding to do things or not, and that it doesn't all have to go one way. So when all of these pieces that have gone out there do come to the right spot. When the curse is lifted, when Ista realizes what she can do, it has this feeling that goes way beyond just I did the algorithmic, mechanistic sort of magic that you see so often. It's much deeper than that.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, it feels intensely influenced by Catholicism, and I say this as someone who was raised Catholic. It's one that has taken a sort of theology of free will to a much further extreme than most Christian theology ever does, because the gods cannot work in the material world, and the only things that come from like the world of the gods or the world outside the material world are these demons, these creatures that don't have will, until they escape from the sort of, I don't know, primordial chaos that the bastard sort of keeps contained. And they enter the world, but they enter the world and they don't have material beings until they sort of jump into an animal or a person. And the gods are like sort of like those demons. They are the demons writ large. They can't act in the world. They can't fit inside a person. So they can't like puppet them the way sometimes the demons overwhelm the sort of the animal mind or the human mind and try to extend their own existence. That is what the demons are trying to do. They're trying to stay in the material world because they will stop having selfhood if they return to the bastards. The novels call them hell, the place of unbeing and primordial chaos. But the gods are immaterial beings, and they can have material effects, but only by linking the material world with immateriality, and they can't do that very much because that's not the way the material world works. So it really relies on the free-willedness of the human souls and human beings acting in the material world, and it has taken the sort of primacy of free will and practice and good works to a fantastic, and I mean that in many senses, endpoint. And one of the things that I think is really, really interesting is that there's a heresy. There's the Rognari heresy, which puts which thinks of the bastard as just a big demon and doesn't worship him and doesn't allow him space for acting in the same way that they allow the other four gods. They've they've cut off the things out of season because they don't have a place to fit. I think that's sort of interesting because even though the narratives and the experience of the characters that we see and their experience of the divine makes clear that the five gods are gods and on the same level, that the whole world is not in agreement on. And in other books, there's sort of more things in the world than just the gods. The Hallowed Hunt, there's the experience of a slightly different. There's a shamanic tradition and different sort of relations that's wider than. There's not just one way of thinking about things. And even though from the point of view of all the characters that we spend time with as readers, the Rognari are wrong, the Rognari don't have any good way to know that they're wrong because the gods don't act that way.
The Rognari are sort of a strange, I don't know, they're a little bit of a thorny bit in these books because, I mean, specifically in Paladin of Souls, one thing that just is really striking is just their mooks, right? Like, they're like hundreds or thousands of them can be killed kind of without consequence. They seem like just a sort of like weird stand-in villain in a lot of ways.
That's really interesting because that's not my reading of them at all. Coming back to this work as several times as an adult, the first time I read it as a teenager, there was a lot of stuff in it that I didn't understand or that didn't go the way I expected to. One of the things that's sort of explicit in the text is when Ista is exposed to violence, she doesn't see them as she doesn't see the Rognari as disposable. She has sympathy and empathy for them. They're just as human as she is, even though they're the enemy. The narrative has, in a sense, parallels Joan. I might not be pronouncing that right. The Rognari dowager princess, and Ista, the Rognari dowager Royina, because Joan has also been affected by the other side of the curse that affected Shyamalan. Joan is a bitter woman trapped in a role that gives her very little scope. She has responded to this by doing a kind of demonic domination of everything around her because she's not ever had the opportunity to develop in a different way. She wants scope for action in much the same way that Ista wants scope for action. Just their responses to it have been very different. And there's the scene when the assault goes out from the fortress of Porifors to attempt to, make it possible for the fortress to last a little longer. Ista, because of her second sight, feels all the deaths and sort of explicitly says all these souls, they're the same to the gods. there is not a distinction between Shalianese and Rognari. They're just lives cut short, and I do find that the world building is, because of its inspiration from the Reconquista and that sort of, it's sort of easy to see the Rognari, because they are heretically wrong about religion, and that's explicit. It's sort of easy to put them in a place where they are the Muslims and the five gods. The Quintarians are the good Catholics, but I think that's taking the inspirations and maybe putting a little bit too much weight on it, because I think that the narrative doesn't see anybody as inherently disposable, even though sometimes, like, there are a lot of dead mooks in Fortress Porifors at the end of it too. I think that the whole thing is the whole last quarter of the book is tragedy writ miniature. What happens between Arhis and Catilara and Ilvin, this is tragedy. What happens with Arhis is tragedy. What happens with the fortress and the Rognari is tragedy. What happens with Joan and her son and the demons that she's essentially leashed to her is tragedy. And I think that's also something, because we are used to reading fantasy that doesn't treat fighting as tragedy, that it's really easy to... Now, I'm not saying this is my reading of it, right? I'm not saying this is the right reading of it, but I think it's one of the things that it's really easy to, like, read over things that treat destruction of human life as tragedy and just see that as this is the way fantasy things. There are killable people and our protagonists. I don't think that's what Paladin of Souls is doing. That, like, my reading of it is, this is a tragedy, and the fact that Ista survives it and has a role linking the material world and the divine ongoing afterwards is a repair to the tragedy that happened to her earlier in her life, but it doesn't actually repair the tragedy that's happened at Porifors. It makes it less tragic. Like, the tragedy that's happened at Porifors is less tragic because Ista was there and was able to be the saint that she was needed to be.
No, that tracks on the personal level. I guess I just found, coming back and reading it this time, that some of the larger setting of this and what it's drawing on historically just sort of like ports in some kind of odd assumptions. I'm just thinking of the sheer number of Regnari, right, who are coming in, and they're not they're not portrayed as like unsalvageably evil or something like that, but like we see them do lots of really awful things in this sort of one-sided way. They come across as like kind of bizarrely inept, and like we sort of learn the reasons for that, but you get this vision of basically like sort of like shining Christian knights easily wiping away this like barbarous rabble in this in the sort of larger picture of it. And it's it's so much drawing on, and I don't want to put all of the weight and implications of the inspiration into this fictional tale, right? This is a complicated time, making Isabel your hero sort of your kingdom. You have to think about a lot of stuff that Isabel did, and a lot of it wasn't great.
Yeah,
and obviously that's not within the fiction, but I kind of catch edges of that, and it just makes me wonder a lot about the Regnari and how they work, and why the gods have not revealed. They've revealed obviously some of themselves to them, right? Because they are the Regnari do have a real connection to 4 of the gods, but not the 5th. It leaves me with a lot of questions, and I think there's a long history in Anglophone fantasy, which is based on versions of European history, to sort of carry in a lot of things, including Islamophobia, right? And I think this is, one thing going on in the background here.
Oh yeah, and I'm not saying it's not there. I mean, considering the time that it was written, considering the amount of background Islamophobia going around in the late 90s and early 2000s, particularly the early 2000s.
Yeah, right.
That it's hard to get away from that. But also, I think the fact that the Rognari have a quadrine heresy in a world that what narrative makes clear is actually Quintarian is also, in addition to maybe bringing in the historical Islamophobia of the period of the Reconquista, emphasizes the aspect of free will. The gods can't act in the world without humans being open to it. There's a bit in the Penric and Desdemona series. There's Demon Daughter, and then there's there's a little bit more about the Rocknari. There's also the one in which Penric is kidnapped by pirates who want to sell him because he's very pretty. I forget which title that one is. Where you also get a little bit more of the Rocknari, and making the Rocknari slavers and generally have more cruelty to them doesn't seem right when you look at the historical influences. But also that it becomes clear from those books that the bastard works among the Rocknari as well. There just isn't space for them to acknowledge him in the same way, and I think that's really interesting sort of world-building support for the primacy of free will in the theology. The gods can't act where people don't make space for them, and if people decide that they're not going to make space for them, then it's really, really hard for the gods to correct that.
I do love that tension in these of, a system that is based around free will, but also that the gods work by like sort of submission or openness to them, right? So like having that tension central to it. And so much of these books being about allegiances and loyalty or breaking them or not. It's a lot about like choosing who you give up some of your will to.
In a military aristocracy, which is what's here in Chalian, in Ibra, in the Rocknari, that a person submits and follows the directions of an aristocratic superior in return for protection and benefits is the same way in which you give up some of your autonomy to get back something else necessary. Bujold has built a world that works as a whole world, has a worldview that works, because the way that people relate to the gods is also very similar to the way that they relate to their secular overlords. And I think that's sort of, there's a resonance there because it's a military aristocracy, and the military are basically they're the ones who are commanding the military action. We see this directly with Artis and Ilvin at Castle Porifors, and indirectly with Ista acknowledging that her daughter and her daughter's husband are going to be leading the military assault on the Rocknari territory later on in the year. The gods are sort of, I think Ista might even put it in this way, the gods is like her general, or the gods are like the generals and commanders sitting there setting up their troops and relying on them to get things done. I can't remember if that's in Paladin of Souls or in one of the other books. It's just sort of that sort of resonance between the secular and the numinous that brings things into a greater unity.
Let's I want to take a quick break and then come back to some stuff here. I'm going to grab just a drink of water and see if I can stop my dog from snoring quite so musically right outside my door. I'll be back in just like 30 seconds. All right, so we are back. We are still talking about Paladin of Souls. Usually with episodes on here, what I try to do is we start out tight on the book and then we go big, but we've been kind of big the whole time, and now we're maybe going to go back in tight again. I know I had a couple things that I wanted to make sure we touched on. I know one thing I wanted to mention just in brief is how good the sort of like romance strain is in here, which is it's some great stuff. But I know we wanted to talk about gender roles a bit. So what did you want to tell me about that?
One of the things that Bujold is doing is just providing a variety of responses to the restricted gender roles that are available for women in Chalian and the surrounding area. Like, we are introduced first to Ista at the center of a very female household, a female aristocratic household, and then very soon after, there's a middle-class woman that she encounters, a middle-class woman who's on a pilgrimage and is, having the chats, telling Ista everything about everyone, not realizing that is in fact the Dowager Royina. But then we meet the messenger, the horse-riding messenger, Liz, who is young and free and rides very fast horses from one end of the country to the other. She really likes her jog because they give her fast horses and get out of their way. And Ista essentially is like, I want to be free like that. Liz, you'll be my lady-in-waiting while I'm on my pilgrimage, won't you? Essentially kidnaps Liz to be her lady-in-waiting. I mean, Liz agrees to this, but then once they've been on the road for a while, and then they get to the meat of the thing. Ista has been they've been kidnapped by Rocknari, who have got kind of lost, and they've been rescued by the Lord of Castle Porifors, who is Arhis, who is connected to Ista's past through her great failure with the Lord de Lutes, I think. But Arhis is about Ista's age and is married to a much younger woman, Catalara, and also has a half-brother, Ilvin, who will become relevant to Ista in the course of things going on. But Catalara is truly, deeply, and in an appallingly teenage manner, loves Arhis so much, and is also incredibly trapped by the gender role. And when I was reading this myself as a teenager, I was like, oh, Catalara, she's not a very nice person, and why is Ista being so compassionate towards her? And as a woman closer to 40, as a person closer to 40 now than I was back then, she's so young, and she's so trapped, and she has married this beautiful man. I mean, the first thing that Ista thinks about him, essentially, is he's gorgeous and attractive, who is also incredibly competent at his job of being a border march lord. He's basically a superstar, and his brother is, well, nearly as good, but not as pretty. And her reaction to... This is going to spoil the whole thing, but we're discussing it. Arhis is already dead. Arhis has received a fatal wound months ago, and Catalara has become possessed of a demon and is using has only one focus, and this is why she's still in charge and the demon isn't. Her focus is to keep Arhis alive by drawing the life out of his brother Ilvin, to keep Arhis alive because she needs him. She needs him, she needs a child, but mostly she needs him because she loves him, but also because her position in society is needs to be married to a lord. Otherwise, she'll end up like Ista, widowed and a failure. And one of the things, Ista has a knot to untie to save as much as possible from essentially the disaster that was already in existence at Castle Porifors before any of the Rocknari showed up, or at least before any of the Rocknari who are attacking them showed up. One of the things that Ista does is offer Catalara the chance to know when Arhis is going to die, and to support him in doing that, rather than keep her unconscious and only let her know it after it's happened. Ista essentially treats Catalara as an adult with a right to her own free will and autonomy, that she can say yes to it's a truly awful situation for anybody, right? You're going to lose not only the person that you're 19 and deeply in love, but also your primary...
Yeah, your whole standing in society, everything that supports you. Yeah, right.
And it's partly your fault in the first place that things are in this mess because of Arhis had been dead to start with as a result of the Rocknari ambassador. Then the castle probably wouldn't be under attack in the same way. It's just so... The way in which sort of Ista and Catalara and Joan form a triangle of responses to the trappedness
Uh-huh.
of women in an aristocratic male society. And we have Liz here as an example, much lower down the social scale, of someone who is, at least for a time, able to choose a kind of freedom that's not accessible to those, but it has its downsides as well. From a craft point of view, I think this is just, chef's kiss, the bee's knees, the emotional complexity with which this set of relationships between Ista and Arhis, who is the son of a man she failed badly, but who also failed her so badly, and Catellara, who has failed in her role as the wife of a border lord, in her role as a wife and as a march lady. Arhis, who has failed his wife and not quite yet failed his charge, and Ilvin, who is he's essentially the damsel in distress for most of this, the half brother who spends most of his time in a bed unconscious, and his manservant dresses him up in his Sunday bests in the hopes that Ista will be able to kiss him better. But that sort of religious symbolism of kisses, the loyalty and submission and connection and so on, plays into that, and I think that is also really interesting. But the sort of role of the way in which Bujold is paralleling Ista and Catellara is like the way that Joan is the same version of Ista but with a demon rather than a god. Catellara is a much younger version of Ista but with a demon rather than a god, trying to control for her own benefit rather than for a greater benefit. And Catellara is able to act selflessly at the end of things in a way that allows her a greater degree of autonomy and perhaps in the end a greater degree of self-respect. But I just really find that I cannot imagine how much worse a book it would be if that complexity of the ways in which these women resemble and parallel each other was not there.
One thing is just a really quick, just sort of like craft appreciation note is I was really struck reading it this time that Ista basically solves the three-way undead love-ish triangle thing about halfway through the book, basically figures out what's going on. And I remember looking at it and being like, how is there half of this book left? But it's not just other stuff tacked on. It all wraps back around. It's structurally, it's really interesting.
She knows what's going on, but knowing the problem isn't fixing it.
But I think this bigger thing, I guess two sort of separate points. One is that, there's a lot of modern fantasy that imagines a secondary world that just doesn't have patriarchy or that has some sort of, radical gender and sexual identity, equality, right? You see that in a lot of works.
Yeah, and it is fun to read them.
It is fun to read them, but sometimes I kind of I'm left wondering kind of how we got here, or they're kind of not thinking. I guess the thing that I love about this is how Bujold's compassion elevates all these characters. You go from what, as a fantasy reader, if you know anything about history, this is a very sort of stock setting initially, right? It's homophobic, it's extremely patriarchal, but then it has all of these moments where you realize sort of the depth for it. And, you have characters like in Ista's past, right? When she realized that her husband loved this other man. And even though there's a lot of tragedy about that, really realizing that really elevates it.
Yeah.
And even though some of these characters, all of the characters she meets, all the women that she meets are sort of trapped in these roles, these ways that they can kind of set each other free or show each other what's possible. Even that, the very inciting incident here with, the pilgrimage and her getting chatted up by this gossipy lady, that gossipy lady is very trapped in her role, but has also sort of seen what she can do from it, right? And is that is sort of a vision of a sort of more egalitarian, more just kind of do what you want vision that kind of is what sets Ista off. Not a knight, not a priest, not some big glaring sign from the gods. It's just this chatty woman, and she's like, whoa, this is kind of an interesting life.
This woman seems to be enjoying herself. I could enjoy myself. That's possible.
And then seeing that sort of that compassion then redirected again to people like Catellara, even I think towards Joan. And this feeling of the people who have been trapped in these bad bargains and made bad decisions from bad places, and not just totally dismissing them, I think is part of what, I don't know, I've already said it, but kind of just elevates the characters here. And while still being in, a very grounded and hierarchical and restricted society, giving a more realistic sense of how people actually work within those systems. Yeah, I think it's great.
Constraint is in an artistic sense freeing. If there is no limit on what you can do, then you can do anything. But if you have a constraint, then if you're working within the constraint, it's sort of like those really small, what is it called, when you carve a very tiny thing into where you have these really tiny things that have got really, really detailed artworks on them. And it would be a very different thing if it was big.
Oh, okay. I see what you're saying. Yeah.
Or if there were no edges to the picture. I don't know. I think that's. I also think it's really interesting that the more power the women have in this society, the more constraints they're under, behaviorally, in terms of it's expectations that trap them, and Ista at the end comes essentially under the authority and the dominion of the bastard, and steps outside those gender roles because she no longer fits any of them. And that's something that the bastard allows in the Quintarian theology. And one of the ways that Ista could step outside of what was expected for her, and I think possibly the way that Joan couldn't, is that there wasn't a concept of stepping outside.
I actually really loved that moment at the very end when it's sort of like after all the action has happened, when Ista's her elderly retainer, is it Hulvar?
Oh, Lady de Hulvar or Lady de
Hulvar, yeah, is basically trying to put Ista back in the box.
Yeah.
Even though she is of a lower rank than Ista, you get the sense that this could work, right? Like these systems of expectations are so strong that she could be forced into box. Or Ista, resists and does her own thing. But I just love that moment where it's not like this woman is like a villain, right? But like this idea that she thinks this is how you're supposed to work, and I would be more comfortable if you just did the things I expected you to do.
And she is also trapped.
Yeah.
It's the trappedness of it that ultimately makes the way in which Ista escapes to freedom and is rewarded with a handsome and attractive man at the end of it. That's the eucatastrophe, right? She steps outside the social roles because she has a different and divinely ordained but completely different role. But if she hadn't been trapped, if she hadn't gone through the pain and struggle and madness and rejection and all of the various different sufferings, she wouldn't have been able to meet the new role that is there for her, which I think is a very, I don't know, it's just one of the things that strikes me about how this book works as a unity. Even more, I think Curse of Chalion is excellent, but it doesn't resonate for me in the same way, because the depth and density of the ways that the tension between free will and constraint, and the tension between the ways in which tragedy is also tragedy as a testing ground, provides the character building, in a sense, both in the novelistic way and in the sort of humanistic way, for the extent to which a eucatastrophic or a triumphant ending can be possible. Like tragedy as testing ground and the tension between free will and constraint are, I think, thematically the things that this book is doing, because we haven't even talked about Fox and the demon and the way in which Fox contracts a demon and has the potential to become a temple sorcerer, but also has the potential not to have such a good outcome. We don't really see the ways in which constraint and free will work on the men in the book so much, but it's going on in the background. Like Ilvin's role as his lord and brother's somewhat half-brother, and Arhis's role as the lord of the fortress. He's constrained by his role. He's got more freedoms within his role, but he's still constrained by it. The Lord Dilutes and the Ista's husband, back when she was 20, they were constrained by their roles and by their expectations, and they couldn't, I think that's just really interesting as a it's not an argument that's ever resolved, but it's
Mm-hmm.
just an argument that is, and because it's never resolved, it's I think it's somehow more meaningful. Like there's no good way to resolve the tension in human life.
And I mean, I think one of the great things about multiple books in this world is choosing this religion that is literally a nuclear defined family with really clear roles, but then centering them all on the bastard, right? And all on where's the wiggle room within that and outside of that? Where are the things that
Yes,
don't fit? And there's so much going on there.
yes, I think that is, yes, that is absolutely fascinating. And we haven't mentioned the scene in the book that struck me when I read it first and continues to strike me, which is when Ista meets the father of Winter on the stair.
Oh yeah,
And he says, all gods attend on all battlefields, and what parent would not wait anxiously by their door when their child is due home from a long and dangerous journey? You have waited by that door yourself, both fruitfully and in vain. Multiply that anguish by 10,000s, and pity me, sweet Ista. For my great soul child is very late and lost upon his road. And every time I read this, I've cried, right? It just absolutely, because the Arhis is already dead, but the hazard to him is that his soul will be sundered from the gods forever. He is sundered from me, says the father of Winter, blind and deaf and stumbling, with none to take his hand and guide him. You may touch him in his darkness, and I may touch you in yours. Then take you this thread to draw him through the maze where I cannot go. The gods too are constrained, and it takes a human hand to reach across the divide, and reconnect the lost to the sort of numinous unity. And I every time I've read it, this is a religious experience, a divine vision that is just this utter picture of grace and compassion, and the gods suffering anguish on behalf of the humans that are their children, because they can't make things better unless someone else helps them reach across the divide.
mm-hmm.
And it's just, I don't know, it is absolutely, it is the scene that stays with me. It stayed with me from the first time I read it to the first. It affects me almost as deeply every time, because there is just this utter sense of compassion and grace in it, but also that constraint, the tension between, if the father of Winter was able, he would choose for people not to suffer, but the material world, there are rules in the material world, there are rules in the world that even the gods are constrained by. I don't know, it makes their compassion and grace believable, because they can't act on it. They need other people to act on their behalf. Because a lot of the time in fantasy, it's frequently hard for me to believe why anybody would respect a god.
Yeah.
Right? Some of the gods that are portrayed in fantasy are like, yes, but why worship?
And back to that, I mean, this idea of, right, the gods as something surpassing human nature, or something, human nature amplified, thinking through, taking these connections so seriously. Yeah. We have been going long. There's so much more we could talk about with this book.
I know. I feel like there could be an entire seminar series just on that book, much less the other ones.
As I mentioned briefly at the beginning here, like there's like serious romance angles here that are really well done. I was thinking a lot about, and this ties into both like compassion and will and fealty stuff, but how central animals are to these books. Horses particularly in this one, but there's this real keen attention to non-human lives as well. That's really interesting.
I mean, I actually went looking for critical work on Paladin of Souls, academic deep dives on it, and I was surprised not to find, maybe I was looking in the wrong places, but I was surprised by how little attention has been paid to it in comparison to the Vorkosigan ones.
Yeah. I don't know. I don't know that I've seen, outside of maybe some of the sort of like Mythopoeia, like the Tolkien and Lewis kind of circles. I just don't know that I've seen that much serious attention to more religious fantasy works. And maybe because there aren't that many that sort of achieve this sort of level of seriousness in world. I was thinking a lot about Samatar's Elandrian novels while coming back to this, for just sort of evoking that real feeling of really moving connection to something bigger. But we've gone long. We got to cut it off somewhere. So, Liz, thank you so much for coming on. Before we go, do you want to point people to anything else you're working on or where they can find you online?
I mean, I have had to pull back from reviewing quite strongly on account of being exhausted, and also on account of not realizing just how little time being a parent is going to leave me. But got a 4-year-old now. It turns out it's more exhausting to have a 4-year-old than a 3-year-old. I wouldn't have thought that, but but I'm on Blue Sky at Hawkwing_LB. I'm sure you can put it in the show notes. And I have a WordPress at lizbourke.wordpress.com, and I write about the non-fiction books that I've been reading, because I tend to write about the fiction ones that I've been reading for places like Locus. It's mostly Locus these days. And at some point, hopefully this year or next year, I am finally going to finish writing the very, very long essay about sword lesbians and what they are and why they appeal and what they mean, but I have a lot more feminist theory to read first. And hopefully at that point there will be something book length by me to read. But
wonderful. Oh, cool. Well, I will be looking for that eagerly, as I'm sure many others will.
I really do have to figure out where to fit in working on it into all the other things. But I thought this was going to be a nice little short essay that I could pitch to somewhere, and then after 5,000 words I realized, oh, bloody hell.
Nice. Oh, well, that's exciting. Well, yeah, thank you again so much. Hope you have a nice time of the days getting longer, slowly but steadily. So,
thanks, Casella. It was great to talk to you.
A Meal of Thorns is a podcast from the Ancillary Review of Books, an online magazine founded to address the radical possibilities of criticism, with a focus on speculative fiction, world literature, and utopian impulses. Go to ancillaryreviewofbooks.org for regular reviews, essays, interviews, and more. Our opening poem is by Bartrahari, translated by John Bruff. Our music is by Giselle Gabriel Garcia. Our artwork is by Rob Patterson at The Ratio Farm. If you'd like to support the podcast and the Ancillary Review of Books, congrats! You may be good. A few different ways you can do that. You can join our Patreon. Throw us a couple bucks a month to keep the podcast and the magazine sustainable. You can hang out with us on Discord, and we've got a few other perks on the way. If you're interested in a book we mentioned on the podcast, buying from the bookshop link in our show notes or at the ARB website gets us a cut. It helps immensely if you just help get the word out about the show. Leaving a review, commenting, or sharing on your platform of choice, that really helps. And it's nice to know you're listening. Questions, suggestions, elaborate compliments? Drop us an email at mealofthorns@gmail.com, and you can also follow us on Blue Sky for however long that stays cool, and probably slightly past that. Next time, ready your oxygen tanks and your psychological defenses. Poet, scholar, and translator Alexander Dickow is on the show to talk about Serge Brusilow's very trippy novel, The Deep Sea Diver Syndrome. We've got some other great stuff coming up. Check the website if you want to read ahead. And as I said up top, we've got a fundraiser incoming, and we'd love your help spreading the word. Thanks for listening, and stay critical out there. I gotta tell my dog to stop snoring, but then I have thoughts about this. Hey, Tip. Tip. Thank you.